Hello, everybody.
Hi.
We're going to have a full house tonight. There's Christina. That's good. Oh, I chopped off my head.
There. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But the other thing is like something like that, like the people that were doing the casting, and I mean they obviously saw a lot of something in you to have you even be that in that cut. And so
Somebody's
who
not
knows
on
what
mute if they're having a
happened
private
or something, but I
conversation.
remember seeing that girl. Mm-hmm.
Can you see where the cursor is?
Can't see that?
Oh, put your glasses on.
Christina, I saw you for a minute. Are you on?
I'm here.
Okay, good.
Hey, Christina.
Hey, Bruce. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm all right.
Good.
I had to do a Zoom update before I hopped on, and now everything looks different.
It always happens and it always happens when I'm running late that I'm like, oh no, Zoom updates. Luckily, I had a bunch of board meetings last night, and so it happened then as opposed to tonight.
Yeah, so I'm having a hard time figuring out where I control people's mute or not. So I'm going to have to rely on you guys to keep yourself muted and when you're not talking.
So we should be on mute, right? You probably can't hear this.
Well, not right now, but as soon as Christina starts.
And can we do the thing, Tori, where just because it'll help me to see. Oh, and am I okay to share screen too, is my other question.
Well, let's see. Where are people? Here we go. Alt U. Alt U. There we go. Now I got people. Let's see. All right. I just made you a co-host, so that means you should be able to share.
All right, let me just see if I can do that.
That's good.
Yep, I should be able to share screen. It looks good. And then do you do the thing where you pin or in view, or maybe you let other people make the choice about if they want to pin me larger? I was just thinking, I did bring a boatload of chapbooks to share what they look like and what other things look like. So it might be helpful to pin me larger. I don't know if you do that when you do it.
I think everybody has to put you in speaker view. So
Gotcha.
we're recommending that you put your screen in speaker view. Now I gotta figure out
How do you do that?
I think we're
Hang on a minute.
big for us.
Up in your upper right-hand corner, there should be something that says view with a little grid of dots.
Yes.
And if you click on that and you click on speaker view, it might have been in gallery view. Then who's ever speaking should appear larger. Since I'm speaking, it might be me right now, although we sometimes get interference. And that way you'll be able to see better.
Yeah,
when I'm holding things up. How is that working for people? Are you seeing, as I'm talking, are you seeing me larger?
no. Definitely.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not.
Because the other thing we can do is we can, I think, Tori, you might be able to pin me larger.
Okay.
I
Let
know
me
that's
see.
something we do sometimes, or you can pin me larger going out.
All right, let me see. Pin. Okay, pinning you. Now can everybody see her?
Pinning.
Yes.
Am I the person that you all see larger?
I don't see
Yes.
anybody larger.
I see you larger.
Yeah.
Who, me?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're
Yes.
full screen right now.
Oh my gosh, why?
It's whoever is
Because you-
speaking, whoever is speaking becomes the large image.
Okay.
It's because of that, yes.
Everybody put the duct tape on. No, we can mute ourselves.
But our main speaker went away.
Well, I'm here. Now am I larger for people?
Yes.
Not
Okay.
for me. Not for me though.
So if I blather away, I'll be bigger, hopefully for most people. If you've got speaker view selected.
See, I don't
Otherwise,
see.
there's spotlight for everyone that I can turn on for you. Is that, what does that do?
We can try that.
Where again is speaker view?
So up in your upper right-hand corner, Bruce, there's a little thing
View.
that says view.
Okay,
Yeah.
I got it.
And
Okay,
speaker.
so it just showed up to
Yeah.
me. It says the host has spotlighted your video for everyone. So now does everyone see me big?
Mhm.
I apologize.
I see you. I see you.
I've got a
Do you
face
see
for
me?
radio, but you get to see me. So does everybody see me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yay!
Do you see me?
I don't,
No, you don't.
I feel like there are ways to make oneself more attractive on Zoom, and I used to know how to do it, but I've forgotten it lately.
It all has to do with lighting, but
Yeah, so I'm blurry. Maybe I'm just blurry naturally in real life, Susan.
No.
No, I'm moving really fast. I
your
am
lighting
rural
is
Mineral
very
Point,
soft.
so my Wi-Fi might not be as exciting as other people's Wi-Fi. It might be my lighting. Good point.
It's very
Roseanne.
soft. Which is okay with me. I'm fine. I'm fine with how you are.
I don't have a ring light. I'm not like those fancy Instagrammers. Let me turn on another lamp though.
Well, good. I'll be back.
Well,
I
that's
feel like
better.
that's no better, man.
it's a little better. It's a little
Is
better.
it? Okay.
I think it's
I've
a
got
little
these-
better.
I've got these like these pot lights behind me, but they're super bright, so I turned those off. I feel like y'all might just be stuck with my face.
You look like a painting, I think.
All right.
Can you see me, hear me?
Should we get going?
Yes.
You want me to
Yes.
introduce you, Christina, or you just want to take it away?
I don't know. What's your druthers?
Well, there's quite a few people on here, so some people may be familiar with you and some people may not. So I think I'm going to introduce you.
Alrighty.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tori Grant Wellhouse with Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets. Welcome to our All About Chapbooks workshop. C. Kubasta's first chapbook, A Lovely Box, won the Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets Chapbook Prize. She's published another chap and 2 full-length poetry collections, 2 novels, and her most recent book is the short story collection Abjectification. She serves as the assistant poetry editor for Brain Mill Press, where she reads chapbooks, among other things, and is also the founding and managing editor of Bramble. Currently, she's the executive director at Shake Rag Ellie Center for the Arts in Mineral Point, as she said. Welcome, Christina.
Hey, everybody. So thanks for joining us tonight. It's a little rainy here in Mineral Point, but we had some sunshine earlier, and I think we're going to have nice weather this weekend. So I understand from Tori, we had some really strong registrations for tonight, which suggests to me that lots of people want to learn about chapbooks, are maybe working on chapbooks, are thinking about chapbooks, and or have questions about chapbooks. So, and it's chapbooks with a P, and I thought we could start with talking about sort of where that word comes from, the history of chapbooks, how that works now, putting yours together. And so I put together a little, forgive me, prior to coming to Sheikh Rag Alley, I was a university professor, so I did do a PowerPoint, but we'll get off of that real fast, and we'll have time for your questions. And knowing that there are so many of us here, I thought we could throw questions in the chat, and they'll pop up as we have questions, and I'll try to respond to those, and Tori can probably help me with those as well, so we can have time for discussion, and then also some time at the end for questions that we didn't respond to, that we didn't answer, because I'm sure there'll be many that I did not think of. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we'll kind of start with the history of the chapbook. As poets, I think we think in terms of image and metaphor. And for me, thinking about where chapbooks came from kind of helps me think about how I want to put them together. Also, as a reader of chapbooks, it helps me think about when I'm reading them, thinking of them differently from maybe a mini collection, or thinking of them differently from a full-length collection, because I think they're kind of their own animal. And so I find that helpful. You might not find it helpful, so totally ignore me if you want to ignore me. But I find that helpful to think about them sort of metaphorically in terms of their history and where they came from. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing that PowerPoint, but please pop any questions in the chat along the way. And if I don't get to them when you pop them in the chat, we'll return at the end and try to answer questions that we haven't answered yet. So I'm wondering if you can see my my screen. Yep. Okay.
Yep.
And I apologize, since leaving the university, I also lost my my access to Microsoft Suite, and we use Google Docs, so it's not quite as pretty as if I'm showing it in slide mode. So I'm going to do my best. So anyway, here we are at All About Chapbooks. So Tori already introduced me, but I write chapbooks and I read chapbooks for Brain Mill Press. And some of you might know that Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets is partnering with Brain Mill Press to do a chapbook contest. And so we're working on those submission guidelines now, but that will be opening for submissions probably early 2024 with a publication date in 2024 or early 2025. So one of the reasons that we're having this workshop, as well as we've done some other chapbook events around the state over the year of 2023, is to share some information about what chapbooks are for people who maybe don't know, and to garner some interest in that type of publication as opposed to other types of publications. I also founded a press, the Muriel Press, at the institution I used to work at, Marian University in Fond du Lac, and so read there. Our last book that we published prior to my leaving was Elizabeth Tornis's, who might be here or was going to be here. I'm not sure if she was able to join us, her chapbook. And then I also founded Bramble and serve as managing editor along with Tori, who does our wonderful layout and graphics. And then we have a rotating guest editor for Bramble as well. So I read poetry and work as an editor as well as being a poet. If any of you are interested in expanding your poetic practice, I would just like to suggest being an editor is a really illuminating part of being a poet. Sometimes learning to be on the other side, I think, helps our practice in terms of when we get rejections or when our work isn't a fit for a piece. I just can't recommend that work enough. Also being a part of the submission process on the other side. And as Tori mentioned, a lovely box won the WFOP Chapbook Prize, and that's actually how I found Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets and became a part of this community, was through their Chapbook Prize. And so WFOP also has an annual Chapbook Prize, which is kind of unique because it's for chapbooks that are already published. And then you submit your work, and the selections are I don't think the submission guidelines preclude works that are in progress, but often people submit, you're able to submit works that's already been published by a press for reading and selection as well, which I think is a pretty cool thing that WFOP does. So here's where I think the history is kind of interesting. So the word chapbook comes from chapman. So there was a chapman who sold essentially inexpensive reading materials. And that's where the word chapbook comes from. Otherwise, it's kind of a weird word and we might kind of wonder where it comes from. So chapbooks were short books. And I don't know if anybody's into bookbinding. I teach some bookbinding here at Shake Rag Alley. And when I was an undergrad, I worked at a press and bindery that did letterpress printing. I've actually got an example from them here to share in a minute. And if you've ever been at an old handset lead, you set the type at one of those old presses, not sort of digital printing and that sort of thing. You might have seen, where you set all the type and then you print on these very large sheets of paper. So this is the part where I think thinking in images or thinking in metaphors is kind of useful for me as a poet. So when those books were printed, they were printed on a ginormous piece of paper, on a single sheet of paper. And the type was printed, your pages were printed, and they were sort of set perpendicularly, that's a hard word to say, to each other. And then after the large sheet was printed, it was folded sort of multiple times. And then those pages were often sewn, on the back edge, and the pages weren't actually cut until you bought the book. But so when we think about the length of a chapbook, and if you're looking at submission guidelines, it often ranges somewhere from 16 to 32 pages. But the reason for that is that these early books sold by the chapman were short books, again, often made by folding that single sheet of paper. So they would often number around, depending on how many folds, how large the book was, either 8, 12, 16, or 24 pages. So this large sheet that I just folded up in front of you actually numbers 32 pages, but you've got to imagine a few pages at the front or back for title, end papers, dedication, the colophon that would go at the back, which gives you information about the typesetting and that sort of thing. And that's why the chapbook is essentially the number of pages it is. And I don't know, for me, I find that interesting to think about all of these pages being printed all together, then being folded, and then, essentially with my handy dandy bone folder, once I bought the chapbook, I would then cut the pages. And that's when you open up the book. So I like thinking of my chapbooks when I'm thinking about putting poems together, of them being printed all together, them being folded as one body, and then slitting open the pages and the book kind of unfolding itself. And so when I'm thinking about what poems do I want to put together, how are they going to speak to each other, how are they going to make a cohesive whole as this sort of condensed mini collection, I like thinking of that history of the chapbook and how they came together. So chapbooks were popular because they were inexpensive to print, they were inexpensive to buy, and they were inexpensive to read. And so I think that's another way that we as poets can think of them as being useful for us to write, to put together, to share with a reading public, to perhaps build, some readers as maybe a step prior to a full collection, maybe a alternative path instead of a full collection, because I think people engage with chapbooks differently than they do full-length books. So I just find that history kind of useful. We tend to think of chapbooks as poets as poetry chapbooks, but there are all sorts of other kinds of chapbooks. So early chapbooks often contained folk stories or ephemera or little sort of graphics, little bits like that. But today it's worth noting that a lot of presses, including some really interesting small presses, do chapbooks for poetry. They do chapbooks for prose. So sort of a short story that's shorter than a novella, sort of a longish short story. There are chapbooks that presses that publish prose in that way. So if you write that sort of thing, you can find places for your work like that. There are also ones that do hybrid forms, that do graphic novels, and really almost anything else you can imagine. So there's a great variety of chapbooks. Some are really scrappy and handmade. Some have ISBNs and are distributed through regular channels. And so when you're thinking about what you want to do for a chapbook, there are just a million options. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can just show you some of the varieties of chapbooks that you can access and that you can find. So for starters, as I said, I read for Brainmill Press, and so I brought some of their chapbooks along. One of the things I like about chapbooks is because often small presses publish them, there tends to be a variety in terms of the aesthetics of them, the size, the shape. Sometimes you have some fun and some control over the kinds of covers they do. That can be a lot of fun, especially working with a small press. So these are two of the chapbooks from Brainmill that I had a hand in choosing, and you can tell they use similar designs. So Calf Canyon and the Rise of Genderqueer. This is a particularly beautiful one, though, if anyone knows Kiki Petrosino, I might be mispronouncing her name. It's poetry, prose poetry, but mixed with graphics, and so they do a really beautiful job with including sort of comics or graphic novel forms. And they're right in Green Bay. It's pretty exciting to have a Wisconsin publisher, Wisconsin press. They're a mid-sized press outside of Madison or Milwaukee. So they're really worth checking out if you're not familiar with them and their work.
Who is that again, Christina?
Brainmill Press.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. So again, in terms of hybrid forms, we've got poetry, both lineated poetry, villanelles, I think are a number of them, prose poetry, and then graphics, comics, graphic novel forms. So you can find some really interesting work in chapbooks. I also brought along, so I found this at one of those alongside the Thames in London. I picked up a T.S. Eliot chapbook when I was on study abroad, and which I thought was, just pretty cool. So I was pretty excited about that one. Sometimes people think of chapbooks as things that poets do at the beginning of their career and not later, but I've got Dorian's latest that just came out. So big name poets also do chapbooks. This is one of those scrappy ones I was talking about. It's just kind of hand sewn. So it was a limited edition chapbook that she did. Some of you might remember her from WFOP's 65th conference. I believe we had Dorian come. And again, it's very simple, but a beautiful little mini collection of hers. You'll see chapbook contests a lot. If you're familiar with Rattle, they do an annual chapbook contest. And so, but again, quite scrappy, hand sewn. Yes Books does beautiful chapbooks. Again, a different size than you would expect. So there's some sort of diversity in terms of the size and the shape of their chapbooks, and they do beautiful work. This one is Two Cups. There's lots of chapbook contests is the other thing. So, sometimes full-length books, are a little harder. That there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of people entering those. Sometimes chapbooks are slightly smaller in terms of the submission pool. And then this is Green Tower Press, again, CD DeVank, anyway. I like his work too. So these were all from chapbook contests. I've got some of our WFOP people winners here. This is Steve Tomasco, and this kind of a chapbook that has this kind of setup with the extra fold. I've got one of Jeannie's too. These are called French flaps. This kind of binding. You don't find that kind of stuff in larger commercial presses. And one of the values I think of sometimes using having a chapbook with a small press is that sometimes the bindings will be a little more interesting. They'll take a little more time with some of the design elements. And if you're a person who's into that in terms of your own work, you can find, I guess, some of these kind of interesting bits that maybe you wouldn't find with a full-length book with a commercial press. or even a larger press, which I think can be quite nice. And then this one is actually a letterpress. Do people know what I mean when I say letterpress? So letterpress is that old school press where it actually makes an imprint on the paper, as opposed to being digitally printed. So you can feel the imprint of the letters. And I don't know if I'm just dorking out about that, but I love that. I love the idea that like our poetry can be tactile, you know? And so this one also has sort of beautiful like limited edition prints in it, and has fold outs. And so if you're a person who wants, you know, to explore your work as like an art object, in addition to it being, you know, printed matter on the page, you might not care. You might just be like, I want a, you know, a larger press with an ISBN, major distribution channels, great. But if you're someone who wants to explore letterpress, I actually just shared Wells College. That's where this is from. That's where I did my undergrad and worked in the bindery. They have a chapbook contest every year, and your book, if it's chosen, would be printed old school letterpress, you know, in the paper with that tactile feel, hand bound. I just think that's kind of beautiful if that's something that you're into. So there are places like that too. Yeah, anyway, there's just lots of options. Wells College, exactly. Q. Yeah. So there are lots and lots of options in terms of publishers, styles of chapbook. You know, if you want a saddle stitch, or perfect bound. I mean, there's just lots and lots of options in terms of style, in terms of aesthetic. I think Dancing Girl and Pork Belly do beautiful chapbooks. But again, you know, do you want an ISBN and larger distribution channels? Then some of those smaller presses might not be for you if they don't do that. And usually all of that information is listed on the submission call. Or do you want, you know, a letterpress hand bound? Then that's probably not going to be an ISBN and larger distribution channels. Then you're going to get X amount to hand sell for yourself at readings. But it's a question of what you care about, you know, in terms of them. But there's just a ton of diversity in terms of the chapbooks and the style and the way they look. I can pop back to my PowerPoint for a whole bunch more information, but do we have any questions right now?
What kind of costs are typically involved with a letterpress?
To you?
Yeah.
I would say there shouldn't be any.
Oh, okay.
So
who incurs the cost then for paper, printing, etc.?
They do.
Oh.
So there are different, so that's actually a really great question. There are different pricing models that presses will use. I will say my two chaps were with Finishing Line, and some people have strong feelings about Finishing Line. Totally fine. Finishing Line does employ a model where they ask you to make a certain number of pre-sales, and your pre-sales determine your print run. Some people don't like that model because they feel as if that's paying to publish. I wouldn't quite call it that. That is what enables them to put out so much work, and it enables them to essentially ensure that they break even and keep publishing work. Some people would say that the author should have to do essentially no work, including pre-sales, and I fully respect that opinion. I'm not quite fully there on that. I didn't mind having to, you know, try to gin up pre-sales, but I do not think that you should, I mean, paying a submission fee is one thing, as long as it's not a submission fee that's exorbitant. So I'll pay $5-10 maybe for a chapbook submission if it's somewhere I would like to be published, but that's it. I won't go higher than that. So when I see fees of like $25 for a chapbook, that's too much for me and I won't pay that. But that's my personal, you know, we all make our own decisions. For a full length, I'll pay up to maybe 20, 25 if it's a contest that I really want to enter. But for a chapbook, I won't. But beyond submission fee, I don't think that we should pay anything. That's, again, we can all make our own decisions, but that's my thought. So we might pay in time and hustle and energy, right? Because we want to, we're going to set up readings and, we're going to share to all of our friends, hey, please buy my work. And so I'll spend time and energy and hustle, but not money. So those contests, once they pick your work, the production prices, the production costs should be on them. And I know we have a question about the difference between full length and a chapbook, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Charles has his hand raised. Charles?
Yeah. Why do a chapbook in any case?
Yeah,
What's
that's a great
wrong with
question.
Huh?
That's a great question. I've got that coming up in just a minute if we can hold on to that for a
All
sec.
right, okay.
Any other questions?
I have a question. This is Linda. When you submit for a chapbook contest and so on, what are you actually submitting? Are you just submitting your poetry?
Yes.
Or your prose or whatever, but no illustrations or anything?
Yeah, so I would say follow the submission call exactly. So most places will ask you for the poems, sometimes, title page poems. Some will ask for acknowledgement, some won't. If it's hybrid work and so they're asking for a hybrid manuscript and that includes illustrations or graphics, then you would, but it's largely the body of work is essentially all they're asking for. And then they do the production. So they're going to decide layout and all of that.
There's a couple older questions in the chat, Christina.
Go ahead, Tori.
When submission guidelines specify 12-point Times New Roman, is it okay to put titles in larger size or boldface or even a different font?
No. So you do not want to give any press, any reason, any reader, any reason to reject your work. And if you ignore their submission guidelines, you're giving them an easy reason to reject your work. You may well prefer the way it looks a particular way. That's great. It doesn't matter. They're going to do the layout of your book. Do not give them a reason to reject your work, to think this person doesn't read submission guidelines. This person is ignoring us. Don't give them any reason. Whatever they tell you to do what they tell you to do and let your work stand on its own. So I personally think that my work looks best at 1.15 in terms of its spacing. Great. If they ask for it single spaced, I'm going to submit it single spaced because I'm not going to give them any reason to reject my work. Don't do that.
That makes sense.
Okay, and then RB asks, I'm writing about memories of my grandparents' farm. Would a chapbook be appropriate?
Great question. And can we come back to that when we talk about chapbooks? I swear I got a slide that references that and the other question.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yep.
Can I ask here or am I supposed to?
Go ahead.
Got it. So when you're sending submissions to contests and then they select yours, if they do, good for you if they select it. But then they will also, do they edit afterwards? If they do they just take your stuff and design it and put it out there? Or can you expect an editing process?
I would say that's going to depend a lot on the press.
Okay.
I think it's wonderful if you get at least a copy edit. In one of these books, man, I got a typo that's driving me nuts. And good Lord, I wish I had a copy editor. And thank God the most terrible one, I caught crap apple right before it went to press and it was supposed to say crab apple. I wish I had somebody help me with that. So a copy editor would be wonderful, right? And a lot of presses, they'll have their own style guide, right? Where, in terms of M- spaces and things like that, that would be great. It's going to depend greatly on the press. I mean, a lot of them are labors of love, right, by people, and they just don't have the bodies for that. But once they accept it, they'll say, we want the final manuscript by X date. If you have a copy editor friend, send it to them. If you have a really picky friend, your mother, I don't know, send it to them, do everything you can if they don't have that editing step for you. And if they do have that editing step for you, engage in it because it's so helpful. Good Lord, crap apple. I would be dying over that.
Right,
if I hadn't
right.
caught that.
Autocorrect is horrid.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure there's such a thing as a crap apple, but that's not what I meant. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint and make sure I addressed all the other questions that people said. Hopefully. And as we turn to this, the question was the difference between a chapbook and a full length. So in general, so there's no hard guideline about pages, but chapbooks are often shorter. So they tend to range anywhere from 16 to 32 pages. Full lengths tend to be around 45 to 60 pages and or all the way up to 100, right? So each press will tell you in their submission guidelines what they want. And just like they tell us 12-point font, single space, or double, whatever they say, do what they tell you to do. So if they say no more than 32 pages, including title page and acknowledgements, no more than 32 pages. If they say 24 pages of poems, not including acknowledgements, then no more than 24 pages of poems, right? So do whatever they tell you. If you think, but I really need this one more poem to make my collection cohesive, great. But make sure you cut another page so it fits their requirements. Do whatever they tell you to do. There is no hard and fast rule, and there's no point in arguing with a press or with an editor that, no, actually, my definition of a chapbook is don't do that. That's, you're not going to make any friends. Don't do that. Do what they tell you to do, essentially. But in thinking about the chapbook, here's the thing. They're a more condensed reading experience. So I'm rarely going to sit down and read a full-length poetry collection. I'm just not going to do that. I mean, maybe Richard Seiken's new book is out. I can't wait to get that. But I will read a chapbook in a full sitting, especially, one that I love, one that just like grabs me right away. So I think that's really important to think about. A person may sit and read a chapbook in one sitting. So as you're putting your chapbook together, you want to think of that ideal reader. You want to think of somebody who just opens that up, dives into your first poem, and is so engaged and is so pulled in that they might just like turn those pages and devour it. And I think that's important when you're putting them together to think about that reader in that way. It might be like like sitting down a one reading experience, because it's a condensed reading experience. Like a good chapbook's like a really well steeped cup of tea, So it's a different kind of reading experience than a full length, where a person might read a section, where they might flip around. It can be quite a linear experience. It can be a really, in-depth, engaged kind of almost not quite narrative, because I don't mean the poems have to be narrative, but they tend to be maybe read in one sitting in order. And so I think that's important to think about when we're thinking about the chapbook. The other thing about a chapbook is that the poems are often linked in some way. And that doesn't mean they all have to be on a single theme. They can be a thematic link, but they could also be linked stylistically. They could be linked by something formal. There's some way in which these poems make sense together. They make sense next to each other. They speak to each other. Where again, if it were a full length, it would be almost kind of too intense. I think that reading a chapbook can be quite an intense experience because of the way the poems are juxtaposed with each other and speak to each other. And so I think that's important when we think about, as poets, putting these poems together as well. Sometimes a chapbook is like your best poems, but I think that's quite rare. And as a reader of chapbooks, I have to say by the third or fourth poem, I'm asking myself, how are these poems communicating with each other? What do they say to each other? There's a real pleasure sort of 2/3 of the way through the chapbook discovering, oh, this poem references something earlier, or this poem makes me think of this earlier poem in a new light. They talk to each other. They're in a conversation. And then myself as a reader, I'm entering into that conversation as I'm engaging with the poems. So I think we want to think about that when we're putting them together as well. So some poets are project poets. They might sit down and think, I want to write poems about X, and that could turn into a chapbook. Sometimes you might have, say, 10 poems that kind of are oscillating around a topic or around a subject. You might have those quite naturally, and they form this little lump of gold. And then once you lay them out, you might think, okay, I want to turn this into a chapbook. Maybe I need to write a connector poem here, or maybe I want to write another poem that sort of obliquely references these and could become part of this project. And so that's something to think about in terms of the chapbook as well. They don't have to be all, my 6th grade summer camp poems, right? Maybe I've got 3 6th grade summer camp poems, and then maybe I've got some other poems that are my adult self looking back towards childhood, at my age now, that kind of pick up on a thread. Maybe I've got another poem about my mother telling me something about her childhood. Maybe I've got, just, they don't have to be so tightly on a topic that they're sort of tunnel vision, because I think that can be not the most rewarding experience for a reader, but in some way they speak to each other. Is that making sense to people?
Mhm.
Okay. And again, if it's too tight, I think that can be a suffocating reading experience. So I think you've got to allow your reader some moments of reprieve, some outs, that sort of thing as well. But again, it's a different animal than a full length. And it should be, because it can be a really pleasurable, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to devour this. So I guess I'm wondering how many people have something they think is chapbooky.
Yes.
Or maybe you have a kernel of a chapbook that you think could develop into something.
I've got
I
one.
have a bunch of poems.
Yeah.
Okay.
A kernel.
Okay.
I've got a
Katrina, you've got your hand up too. Was that just agreeing, or did you have a question?
No, I have some.
Cynthia, did you have a question, or you're just agreeing?
Just
Okay.
agree.
Okay. All right. So let's say you got this kernel, or let's say you've got, I don't know, 35 and you've got to cut them down. I think sort of the next step once you've got some is to start thinking about how you're going to order them. So some things to think about. I am still a person who prints things out and likes to arrange them like that. I know I'm old, but I feel like the young people on their phones do everything. I don't do that. But when you're thinking about order, we can think about, is there some sort of narrative arc to what you're doing? And again, I'm not using narrative too literally, because I don't think we need to think about poems necessarily in terms of story, although often there's some implied story or implied chronology. So that's perhaps one way to think about organizing things, not by any means the only way, but one potential way. I also think it's maybe pleasurable for the reader to think about creating some tension in terms of the poems. And again, not that sort of straight, we were probably all taught in school that narrative arc, right? You've got exposition and rising action and climax and denouement. I think we should mix that up a little bit, right? Maybe, we start somewhere and we pop back and we pop forward and, we move around a little bit. But as poets, if we're thinking about creating tension, I think that's kind of an interesting question. I do think, and for myself as a reader of chapbooks, I need a banger of a poem early on. And I think that becomes, if you've got a sense of which poem has the most emotional resonance or the most power, or is going to be most affecting to the reader, I think it's a really important question. Where do you put that poem? Do you want that to be the first poem? Do you want to sort of lead the reader in a little bit, have them get to know your voice a little bit before you give them that poem? But it should be somewhere early on. If it's not till page 7 or 8 that I get it, or poem 7 or 8, that's maybe a little bit too late. But I think that that's an important question, where that poem would go. I also think there needs to be a progression in the order in some way. So again, if all of your poems are at sort of a certain level of emotional intensity and there's no change in that, it's like, I don't know, if it's like we're in horror movie season. If there's a jump scare every minute, I can't handle it, right? So if all of your poems are at the same level of emotional resonance, even if it's a really one that appeals to me, I don't know, I need some step down moments and some step up moments. So I think that's kind of important to think about in terms of progression as well. I feel like this is a question that comes up a lot, especially if they've asked for acknowledgements in the submission process. So let's say you've got some really good publications in there. Let's say you've got a few that you're really proud of, that are well known, you know, that you're proud of those. Where are you going to place those? In terms of the order, because you know, when you're submitting on Submittable, and that's how with the press I read for, that's how I read them. We get the manuscript. Now, if the acknowledgements are attached to the manuscript, it's really easy to go to the end and read the acknowledgements. But sometimes those are a separate document, or sometimes you submit those in your cover letter. Depending on how you submit those, it's really easy for people to flip back and forth and see where those are. But if it's a part of the manuscript, which is how I do it most often when I'm submitting, it's like the final page of the manuscript. You know, a person can go and see, oh, this came out in Cream City Review, or this came out in Milkweed, or not Milkweed, Tinderbox, or, you know, whatever you consider a good publication, right? So if you know you're going to have a few of those in there that you're really proud of, hey, my poem was picked, you know, my poem came out in this good publication. And they've asked for acknowledgements, you know that the reader can see, hey, this poem was well placed. So where are you going to put that in the manuscript, knowing that the reader's going to see that and know that? And then something I think is also very personal for us when we're putting together this manuscript is there are going to be poems that you love, regardless of whether they were published or not, right? Poems that you love, that you think are important. That's something to pay attention to. And also, quite frankly, screw whether they got published or not. If you love them, and they should be in there. And by the way, if there are poems that were published well, but you don't love them, don't put them in there. I just want to say that. Your manuscript should be stuff you love, that you care about. There are going to be poems that are challenging for the reader, but are important for the manuscript. That's something to think about. And then there are going to be poems that maybe surprise the reader or deviate from the reader's expectations so far as they've been reading. And that's something to think about too. So I'm going to pop out of this for just a minute so we can talk about that. So, and I know this is going to read backwards. I forgot about it, and I don't know how to do mirror writing, but your strongest poem. Where should you put your strongest poem in the manuscript? Thoughts? First. Katrina says first. That goes number 1, prime spot.
That's subjective, isn't it?
It's totally subjective, but let's talk about it. And yes, published poems can go in the chapbook.
At the end. Yeah.
And someone else says at the end. Mm-hmm. And Brian says, I don't trust my own taste.
I'm wondering if the middle.
Or in the middle.
Because right? Because you got a pivot point in the middle.
Okay, so I'm going back to if we think about the way books were made, right? There are 3 main spots that would grab attention, right? Your first. So this is actually, I love this. So your first is an easy fold, right? Your last is an easy fold, but the middle is actually like a prime spot of real estate. That would be super great if we were dealing with a tactile book. We're not dealing with a tactile book. We're reading an electronic document via Submittable or email. So it doesn't work that way. They're not going to know what the beautiful centerfold is. So that doesn't quite work. It's a great idea, if you can manage that when you put the book together, beautiful. But it's not going to work for reading submissions. Charles.
If you're going to put your best poem first, what are you going to follow it with?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, hey, so if you're in a baseball game, you hit a home run right away and nothing else happens.
You got to have a lot of home runs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So your best, you said, when you talked
Your
earlier, you
strongest.
said your first poem had to be a grabber.
I said you got to have a banger early on.
Right. Okay. So is that is that the same as your best or your strongest?
Well, it's a real good one. So I mean, you all probably have this experience, like you're reading something, right? I mean, when you're reading like a novel or something, if anybody does this, maybe nobody ever stops reading something because it doesn't grab them. At what point do you stop reading?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to ensure your reader doesn't stop reading. So you got to have something really good. I don't know if it has to be your strongest, but it's got to be, you got to have one of your best, right? We can't keep doing sports metaphors, man. I don't know anything about sports. Can't you though, Marnie?
Could
So
you
just saying that's a decision, right?
So one thought that I've had is I was reading a book of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poems, and she picked a line or the title of one of her poems as the title of the book. And so that's where I went first. It was not in the beginning or the end. It was just in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered why would she title this book after this particular poem? And so I went to that poem first, and then went back and then tried to put it all together in terms of how I was thinking about it. But is that another way of approaching it?
So that's a way to lead your reader to something, right? So that might be a good idea. I also like picking a line or an image from the interior of a poem, not a title. And then when I get to that, I'm like, oh, that, because it kind of sucks you in and it creates some emotional resonance, some like an intellectual moment there that I discover on the page. That, so those are all really interesting things to try too.
I was at the writers conference in May in Oshkosh. And when you go around to the tables, looking at poetry books, and I chose one because the title of a poem was Dragonfly. And it's something I love. And I ended up purchasing the book.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So how about so let's say you have one poem. I guess so it says narrative or story in terms of theme. So let's say you have a theme. Let's keep with my theme of, I don't know, revisiting my 6th grade summer camp childhood, things I've learned as I've gotten older. Let's say that's like the overarching theme of my chapbook. And let's say I have one poem that really kind of lays that out, that this is what everything is oscillating around or circulating around. And I've got a poem that really kind of lays that out. It's sort of it's the poem that is literally set at the summer camp that kind of brings it's like in The Big Lebowski, it's the rug that ties the whole room together, right? Where do I put that poem?
Third.
And Q says end. So I like tie it all up at the end. Like you've been waiting for it. Here's where it is.
Yeah, I was gonna say the end. If it ties it all together.
So I make the reader wait for it. I've had all of these bits and pieces, childhood, memory, these there's been a couple scenes at the camp, but I've got this one final poem and it just like brings it all home. I mean, these are all personal choices. I'm just saying, if you've got all your poems laid out, there are a million ways you can put them together, right? And each is going to create a different sort of reading experience. How do you feel about prologues that are titled prologue? That's clear. That's clear, right? Let's say you have a poem that's like super clear. It's very overt. It's a poem that says something like, I'm going to write about my childhood because I'm still struggling with my childhood. Right? You have a very clear poem. Something happened at 6th grade summer camp. You have a really clear poem.
My feeling is that if the poem expresses the theme of the chapbook in a very strong way, put it first. But that might be your second best poem. I would say put the strongest poem second, because that will draw the reader in more, is my inclination. I don't know if it's correct, but that would be my inclination.
Well, and all of these are going to have to do with who we are as poets, what our voice is, what it is we're writing about. But again, when we've got that grouping in front of us, you know, we might want to sort of decide, this is this kind of a poem, and here's where I see it fitting. Let's say you've got a poem that's going to be, Gary, it's going to depend on the press. It's going to depend on the editor.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you
Let's
request
say
it?
you've got a poem that's going to be this says most challenging for the reader. So let's say you've got a poem that maybe it's kind of out of your wheel. It's a little more experimental. Let's say usually you write in more formally, you know, you've got sort of shortish lines, and you use and your readers come to expect a particular kind of style or voice from you. And then you've got one poem that like deviates from that. It takes a turn. So it's going to be a little bit different in the chapbook, and it's going to be different from what the voice and the poetic style that the readers come to expect from you. It's going to ask them to take a risk with you. Where does that poem go?
Maybe the last third.
Okay.
In front of something that is very clear.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you give them they've got a moment, they've got it together, and then they've got a moment.
Yeah.
Like a commercial break.
Yeah.
Okay. Brian's comment just said to provide signposts and placeholders. Is that what that said, Tori?
It says use some poems as placeholders and bridge those gaps.
Yeah.
Question mark.
Yeah. I think sometimes thinking in like we're mapping territory, right? In a way can be really helpful. Yeah, our poems that's like a landscape. It's like a topographical map. And how can we do that? Where do you put your most vulnerable poem?
I would think it would have to be later in the book so that the reader had a chance to get to know you first a little bit. And then
so they have to trust you for you to trust them.
Yeah, sort of.
I kind of like that, Eileen.
And then you fillet yourself in front of them, but then you have time to bring it together by the end.
Yeah.
And
the other comments that popped up said middle too.
I think if you had a couple vulnerable poems, then to intersperse them so you're not reading 2, 3 in a row.
Yeah, that could be a lot. Yeah. All right. I'm going to pop back to the PowerPoint. Do we have other thoughts or questions we want to share at this point? Do you guys think of your poems in these ways? Do you kind of characterize them in this way?
Mean as a sequence?
In terms of, oh, this is a vulnerable poem, or this is a challenging poem, or
yeah,
I find that useful. This is the poem I'll never read if my family's at a reading. You know, but I want it in the chapbook.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to pop back.
I'll just add that I
A lot of people use that stuff against you. That's for sure. Or read way too much into your stuff.
Gotcha. Someone else is talking. Sorry, I talked over
No,
you.
it was just me. There was a question about whether or not I would share the PowerPoint after the workshop, and
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, and I will. Yeah.
Thanks, Tori.
All right. So, okay. So, I was going to talk now about submitting and where to send stuff. But do we have other questions about sort of putting chapbooks together and things like that before I move on to that?
Yeah, I had a question which I put in the chat.
Sure.
You know, do you ever group poems by content or by subject matter, like family, nature, travel, or is that just too ho-hum?
Within a chapbook?
Yes, or is that within larger collections?
Within larger. So I think to have subsections within a chapbook would be kind of hard because it's already so short.
Okay.
One thing I will say though is that if you're working in chapbooks, and let's say you've got one and it doesn't end up getting published, you've kind of already got a lovely little section for a later book. It's something to think about.
Okay.
So thinking in this way, you're already kind of building some structures for later, maybe. But yeah,
Okay.
subsections within a chapbook would be like super short. And I feel like that could lead to like a disjointed reading experience as opposed to a cohesive one.
Okay, so say you could have a chapbook about a trip around the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then that could later become a part of a regular
Absolutely
poetry class. Okay.
Yeah,
Makes
because
sense.
in a
Thank
way
you.
you'd have a little section of 20 to 30 pages, 20 to, you put a few of those together. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a
Okay.
question.
Oh, sorry.
that I put in the chat. It could be a rude awakening if you don't know how a poem is supposed to fit on a page. And so I'm curious to know if there's some rule of thumb about number of lines or size on a page, that kind of thing.
Sorry, I think maybe someone's not muted, so it was just cutting out a little bit. Could you repeat your question?
I'm curious about if there's a thumb about number of lines or how things. I saw someone else. If a poem can go across 2 pages, I'd like to hear about that.
Sure. So if it's a long poem, and it splits across 2 pages, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Again, sorry, I'm just gonna stop this so we can see each other. So, when a poem splits, so first of all, when the press does the layout, they're gonna decide where that page break is. So when you're submitting, you just want it to be clear if you have a stanza break or if you don't have a stanza break. But when the press does the layout, they'll decide how that sort of goes. So you can insert just a parenthetical that says stanza break or no stanza break to make it clear formally if you have one or not, if you write in stanzas. But so just so that's clear for them, essentially. But when they do the layout, they'll decide how they want that to portion out across the 2 pages. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know all that.
Oh, okay.
So one question, which is, in a chapbook, would you across 2 pages? You're saying yes.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if it needs to be, it needs to be.
Is there a standard number of lines for a page?
Oh, so that's going to depend on the size and shape of the chapbook. So again,
so does that mean press will fit its size to your, or
yes.
are there that are expressed ahead of time?
So, again, so this is like a pretty standard size for a chapbook. But some presses will do like a 12 or 10 or 11 point font. So that changes how many fit on there. If you've got a different size of a chapbook, like a shorty, they're going to do their layout. It's really not standard. It depends on theirs. And they're going to send you the layout files. You're going to do a proof run. You're going to see all of that. It's kind of going to depend on them and what they want to do. So I wouldn't say it's standard necessarily, because it's going to depend on what their style is. Am I answering your question or not?
I think you're answering it as best you can, Christina. Rude awakening for me, finding out what are, you actually run into book collection. I was curious if there's much standard number of lines on a page. People typically say 32. Do they typically say 25? I mean, I understand there are different sizes, but if you're going to have single poems, it's the rough standard. No standard.
Yeah, and again, so this is a reason, and on the next slide, when we talk about picking places to send, you should familiarize yourself with the press, because most every press would have sort of a style that it does. And if you're looking at other presses or other books a press has published and you're like, I don't even like the looks of it, and I've chosen not to submit to presses because I don't like their production values. And if you're looking at the way they do layout and you're like, I don't like this, like, I don't like the way the poems appear on the page, I don't like how they put a book together, don't submit your work there, because you wouldn't like the way your work looked when they published it either. So, I mean, I think in all things, we want to do a little research on the people that we would trust with our work. And so not only what kind of work they publish, but sort of the aesthetics of the work they put out. Like if they tend to do like a 14-point font and it's like ginormous and your work wouldn't fit well and be beautiful on the page, don't submit there. Does that help a little?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Fine.
All right, I'll go on to submitting unless anyone has another question.
Christina, yeah. Is there a way to know if I can have any involvement in the design of the chapbook?
So in general, smaller presses do tend to engage their authors more. I will say that one of the things I did like about Finishing Line is that I got to have some control over the cover. And so like this one was one of my students that was graphic design, and I thought, how great would it be if he got a cover for his portfolio? So I loved that. And so smaller presses tend to ask the author if they want to be involved, and you can sometimes have some engagement with that. I think that's really cool.
Pick your cover.
So often there's sometimes something in the submission call, or if you look at reviews of the presses, you can find stuff like that. But smaller presses, sometimes you can be involved in. If it's a huge press or a larger press, it's very, very, very unlikely.
Right. Okay.
And when you get to the contract phase, that stuff will often be included in the contract too. It'll say something like, we'll consult with the author on Bloody Blue, or it will say, provide your materials by such and such a date, and then you're done, essentially. So at the contract phase, there's some of that. But when your work gets accepted, that's when you can ask all those questions too. So if they say, we really want to publish your work, we love you, that's when you can say, wonderful, I'm so excited. By the way, would there be any way I could be involved in X? And that's when you would ask those questions.
Good, thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna just get through this last bit and then we can talk more questions. So with anything else, just do your research essentially. So you want to know if your work aligns with the kind of work the press publishes. So what I do is I look at their lists, I look at their previously published books. Do I like the poets they're publishing? I look at their submission call, what they're looking for, and I figure out if my work might be a good fit for the press. So if they say they're interested in experimental authors and I write formal poetry, that's not a good fit and I'm not going to send my work there. If they publish mostly LGBTQ+ authors and that is not you, don't send your work there. If you read their authors, if you read their poets and your response is, I don't like this poetry, don't send your work there. Those are not good places for you because your work doesn't align with the kind of work they publish. That is wasted time, energy, resources, and submission fees from you. So find a good fit for your work, and send your work to places that align with your work. Otherwise, so I don't think scattershot's the way to go. I know some people are like, just going to send it everywhere. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think that you should find places where you're like, oh, this work is super exciting. I love this poet. I would love to see my work in their catalog. This kind of thing that they're doing is the kind of thing I like to do, or I try to do, or I dream of doing, or this is aspirational for me, and I would be so excited. That's where you should send your work. But if it doesn't, if it doesn't do it for you, like you hate the poets they're publishing, don't send your work there. That doesn't make any sense. So, just like when we send our work to magazines, if it doesn't make any sense, don't send it there. Other things to think about with chapbooks. So everybody knows what an ISBN or ISBN is, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for some people, that's really important, and for some people, it's not. So when I was teaching at university, my books needed to have an ISBN because they need to be considered quote unquote real books by my promotion and tenure committee. So I needed to have an ISBN. Now I don't care. Now I can send to a bunch of presses that I think do beautiful work, but they didn't do an ISBN. So before, I kind of needed to leave them off to the side. And there are some really great small presses that publish really interesting work, but they don't invest in an ISBN because they do small print runs. They do beautiful, like scrappy, hand sewn with like really interesting artwork, but it's mostly like you get your work out through their distribution channels and you hand sell, but they publish some amazing work. So now I'm excited that I can send to those places because I don't have to do an annual report on my bloody blues. So if ISBNs matter to you, then look for places that have ISBNs. That's a consideration to make. Another thing to think about is what kinds of distribution they have. Again, if you're excited to have your work in print and you're happy to hand sell at readings and at book fairs and conventions and things like that, great. If it's important to you to have your work on Bookshop and Amazon and Spark and Ingram distribution channels, then you want to know up front if they do that. I don't think any of us, maybe I'm wrong, I'm just going to take a bold guess, are really going to get rich as poets. So, does it need to be accessible, in all of these ways? Or does having, a few hundred copies of your poetry chapbook circulating so that people can access your work, make decisions about what you want? Production value. Again, I think having a beautiful book is a beautiful thing. So to me, it matters what the book looks like. It matters to me if I love the artwork. It matters to me if it's a beautiful thing to hold in my hand. The tactile matters to me. I think letterpress is stunning. I think, running my fingers over a physical imprint of those letters is really friggin' cool. Other people that might not matter to them. So production value might be something that you care about. I love the matte cover thing that so many presses are doing now, where you can get the matte cover as opposed to the glossy. I don't know. It matters to me. I like that. I would always select that. So if that's something that matters to you, you can think about that with a press. And again, the only way you're going to know that is if you check them out and see what other kinds of books they've published, which is a good thing to do. To the question we just had, how much support and or engagement do you have in the process? If it matters to you that you have a say over cover art, go with a smaller press. If you want to, I don't know, shoot the cover to a good friend of yours. All of my poetry books, I've been able to have an artist friend do the cover or do some interior illustrations. And that mattered to me, that we could then work collaboratively on something. So I've gone with small presses so that I could do that. If that matters to you, then that's the way to go. If it doesn't matter to you, then don't go that way, or don't preclude, like, knock anybody out of the running where you're submitting, if that's, not a thing that matters to you. And then there are some resources on here. So I don't know if anybody remembers Entropy. which used to be a really great online magazine, and they had this where to submit feature. After they went out of business, Heavy Feather Review took it over. Heavy Feather Review, oh, shut up, Microsoft's wrong, is a great resource. So they've got stuff divided here into presses, chapbooks, journals where you can send individual things, and then other opportunities. So on and they tell you, you know, if there's a submission fee, they let you know what they're reading and what their submission period is. So, and this gets updated, I think, quarterly. So those were all presses, but here's the chapbook stuff.
Percentage.
So Bateau Press is reading August 1st through October 15th. Obviously that just passed, but it tells you what they're reading for chapbooks. So as I said, they read all sorts of things: poetry, fiction, flash nonfiction, and hybrids. There's a fee of $14, but this is a prize, so it's $250 plus publication. Diode, Disorder. Now this is just, this isn't a prize. They just publish, but they read year round. And so I like Heavy Feather for these listings that, again, get updated quarterly. And you can go on here for just to submit poetry, again, the journals and anthologies listing as well. And here's micro chapbooks. So there's also a thing called a micro, which is usually 12 to 15 pages, 10 to 15 pages. But this is a great resource for finding places as well. And they're each hyperlinked, and then you go to their site or their submittable page.
Are you showing something to us here that I'm not seeing? I just see Heavy Feather Review. That's all.
Oh, I'm sorry. You not seen the listings?
No.
Oh, shoot.
No.
Is anybody seen the listings?
Yes.
Nope.
I'm not.
Yes.
No.
Oh, protect.
Not on the screen, Christina. If somebody went on their own to the web page.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I see them off to the side, but they're too tiny to read. They're
Okay.
just a row of slides.
Sorry. So if you click on that link, you'll see there are listings for
Okay.
for all sorts of different chapbooks, and it tells you due dates, it tells you submission fee, it tells you prizes if there are prizes, and it tells you what they're reading.
What link should we click on?
The Heavy Feather Review.
And this is in the document when you send it out, when you make it
Yep,
available.
you'll get it. You'll get it. Yep,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah, it doesn't work here, but it'll work when we get.
Sorry, my bad.
You know.
All right, I'm back on the slides for all of you that are still on the slides. So then the other one that's hyperlinked there is Poets and Writers, you know, Poets and Writers magazine. It's their online companion. They have classifieds that you can search. So you can search by small presses, and then you can search for chapbooks. That's also free. These are all free ones, essentially. And then how many people use Submittable?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. It's free. It's got a pretty good search feature. You can
Yes.
just search with the keyword chapbook. If you haven't done that, or I think it's called Explore. So you can explore using the tag chapbook and find all sorts of things. So that's another way to find places to send chapbooks. So again, other things to think about: submission fees. I've already shared my philosophy on submission fees, but you know, make whatever choices you want to make. I think that all of these should accept simultaneous submissions, and that shouldn't be a thing. You know, I think very few places don't take simultaneous subs anyway. Timeline, it takes a long time for reading of chapbooks and getting them back. You shouldn't wait to get anything back before you send anything out. You should just send out. If for some reason you get 6 chapbook acceptances, you know, bully for you, and then make a decision about where you want to publish.
Wow.
I'm just saying, like, don't wait, you know. And the last thing I want to share, this was actually at a WFOP conference as well. It was Mark Doty who kind of gave this advice. And I know this is kind of hard sometimes, like we get a rejection and then we have feelings. But he said really that once you start sending your work out, you're not the poet anymore. You're essentially your own secretary or administrative assistant. So once you get those poems back, you get that manuscript back, you just, you nick off whoever you sent it to. Fine, you've already sent it to them. You just repackage it and you send it out. So it's like you're not you're your administrative assistant. A package has come in, you repackage it and you just send it out again. The key is you've just got to find the right press and the right readers, and you've just got to send it out. You just send it out until you find them. Poetry is so subjective. I mean, however many of us are in this Zoom room, we each like different things, and because we're different people with different experiences and different reading styles and different subjectivities. And on a different day, on Tuesday, I might have liked something that on Thursday, I'm like so sick of, So we just keep trying. We find a new place to send it. And just, set aside and just repackage it and send it out. This made more sense kind of when we actually like put stamps on stuff and put it in envelopes. Now it's all virtual, but still, we just put it in a new envelope and we send it out. Put it in a new envelope and send it out. It just wasn't the right place. So questions. All right. There's a whole bunch there and Tori's going to help me. And I'm also going to look at the chat. All right. So okay, Amazon self-publishing things. So if you want to get your work out, and you don't want to wait and you want to get it out in front of readers and you've got people you want to share it with, go ahead and share your work however you want to share your work. Looking at the editors and what they write and what their aesthetic is, if you think that's going to help you like connect with a particular person who's reading your work, that's just, in my thought, another kind of research you can do. Just like what the press publishes. If you know what the editors, what their jam is, that can be helpful if you want to go ahead and do that. That's just another kind of research to do.
Contest.
What kind of activities would a published chapbook author do? Eileen, in terms of like, once you get a book out, what do you do? Is that your question?
Right.
Oh, I mean, I think you could call people and set up readings. You could, hang out with your poet friends and like set some stuff up. I mean, same.
So that's
same
on the poet.
Oh yeah. I mean, anybody like paying us to do that stuff, I think would be pretty rare.
No, but I mean, as far as like, does the publisher say to you, oh, we've arranged this reading that we would like you to do, that kind of thing?
Oh, there might be some of that, yeah. Or we're going to be at such and such a book fair conference. Would you like to come and share your work? There might be some of that, yeah. But again, the smaller the press, the more it's a labor of love. Right. And I think anything that we want to do to promote ourselves, it would be great.
Okay.
And anywhere online you can find a list of inexpensive ways to share your work, or these are 10 things your friends can do to support your work, and all, like call up your local libraries and say, hey, request my book. And I mean, there's always things like that. All of that hustle we can do, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
There's an older one, Christina. What % of poems in a chapbook should have been published in journals?
So there are a few presses that, which I think is really wonderful, will be very specific. They'll say no more than 50% can be published. If there's something specific like that, that's great. Otherwise, I'd say there's not a hard and fast rule. But if it's all of them, I think that's kind of a problem. I don't know. I like to have a handful-ish. I kind of, not that they have to be, but I feel good if I'm sending out a manuscript and it's like a third. I kind of like a third. I don't know why. It's like, look, people like these. Somebody wanted to read them. Now look, you get to read more.
Mhm.
I don't know. I feel good about that, but that's just me. But I feel like if it's all of them, that's kind of a problem because you want to share something new. You know, you want to be like, and look what else I did. Okay. Jenna. Okay, so she says, when trying to weed out poems to fit the chapbook length requirement, is it better to include lots of variety in form, haiku, sonnets, ghazals, which I never pronounced correctly, prose, as long as some stand out and content holds together, or weed out a haiku since it is so odd looking when placed next to a free verse with long stanzas, weed out the 1 or 2 formal poems even if content is cohesive. Okay, so I feel like there's a 2-part answer. One is, where are you sending it? If you're sending it to a press that loves lots of formal experimentation, it would make sense to have formal experimentation. Also, it's a you question in terms of what holds back together, what poems do you love, what speaks to each other best. So there's, you know, it's a you question. What poems do you love? What do you want in there? What do they say to each other?
I think this other question is about collaborative collections.
Yeah. Oh, so there are presses that will, so there are some that say no collaborative work, but there are some that specifically ask for collaborative work. So you can find those if you look for them. And that would be awesome. I mean, there are some that ask for collaboration between artists of different medium or genre. But there are some that are okay with collaborative work, and that would be really cool. So you can find those, Judy. And that would be really cool. But again, now how do you pick your poems that speak to each other and then arrange them in such a way that speak to each other? But that would be really cool. Katrina says, for chapbook contests, how much formatting do you do when there are not detailed guidelines? Oh, if they're not giving you stuff, I feel like you've got some leeway. I feel like they would probably say acknowledgements or not acknowledgements. Unless they say not to paginate, I would always paginate. And then table of contents, if they don't tell you to or not to, I guess it depends on if you need the page or not. But I feel like most places would say acknowledgements or not, because I feel like that's kind of a big deal in reading them. There randomly is a chapbook template in Word, although it mostly allows you to print double-sided so you can make your own chapbooks at home. So I wouldn't use that for sending out for submissions.
I had asked the question about my grandparents, memories of my grandparents' farm.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it'd probably be 10,000 words or less. Is that too many for a chapbook?
I guess my question would be, so is it poems or prose?
Prose.
It's prose?
Mm-hmm.
How are they prose poems or is it prose? Like
prose, all narrative.
So I think you're still gonna find in chapbook calls, it's gonna come down to page number. They're gonna say prose of X many pages. So it would be how it translates to pages.
Yeah, if you go like 250 words, it'd be about 40 pages right now.
Man, I can't do math on Thursday.
Pardon?
I can't do math on Thursday.
No,
If it
no,
works,
it would be 40. I mean, at 8,000 words.
Yeah.
Divided by 250, that's about 40 pages.
So, so you might find one that would go up that high, depending on, or maybe just do a real good edit and get it down.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You might have luck looking for like a micro novella call or something like that.
And I have a publisher that has published a prose and poetry already. And so she might do that as well. So, but
sure,
I was interested in chapbooks because they also like to write poetry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Oh, so Susan, if you find, so again, I think some of the smaller presses or hybrid presses might do that. It wasn't a chapbook, but my first book of poetry was with BlazeVox, and once we got, the question was about photos with poems. Once we got, they accepted, they were actually open to doing interior illustrations, and that's when my friend Molly Oblinger, the artist, created artwork to go with the poems. So some small presses would be open to that. I'm assuming you mean your own photos, Susan?
You're my husband's.
Okay, yeah, but you don't need permissions or anything because that
No.
gets dicey.
No.
Yeah, so I think with a smaller press, that would work. And again, there will be some calls that you'll see that'll say poetry with artwork or things like that, and those would be places to try too.
Okay, can you give us the names of some of these small presses? You said you know of some, but
So
that you've
again,
had
I'd
experience.
look on Heavy Feather and you'll see where it'll say it'll say hybrid forms, it'll say poetry with artwork. You know, those are the because they'll list them quarterly. Yeah.
Okay, thank
Other questions?
Yes, I'm on mute.
Whoever just said they were on mute, you weren't because I heard it. If you have a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, Brian, I would look at submittable. Again, you can use keyword search terms. You can use chapbook as a term. I think it's the explore button. I'd try that place.
Christine,
I'm surprised by what I find there.
can you hear me?
Yes, if someone's trying to ask a question, I can hear you.
Oh, good. I've written a manuscript which is largely historical in nature, but the historical episodes in it were not chosen because they were related to each other, because I don't think history works that way.
Okay.
I think people tend to look at individual episodes first, just for the episode. And I don't think history goes in any particular direction that I can discern. So the only thing that knits these together is chronology. They take place at different points in time. And if people see links between them, good for them. But I want them to read individual poems first, just for the individual poem. And many of these episodes are not very well known in American history, which is one reason I wrote the book or the manuscript. Does that do me?
Oh, we just made that be a chapbook.
Let me put it to you this way. An awful lot of poetry doesn't deal with history at all anymore, or at least not, say, 19th or 20th century history. It deals with contemporary historical events and tries to make an ideological point of some sort, lead to some conclusion about the way things are going. And I don't do that because I don't know it. So I want to write poems which express the variety in history, which is what I've done.
So do you have a question?
Yeah, does the fact that these poems don't link together, I mean, that's the theme, that they don't.
Oh,
Is
so
that okay?
yeah, so my two poetry chapbooks have no link other than formal weirdness. So the second one, which nobody says the way I say, is actually ampersands. And the only reason the poems are together is because they use the ampersand liberally in a weird way. And my first chapbook, the only way it's linked is in its use of weird excerpted text. So I think that again, in terms of the variety of chapbooks, like as long as it's cohesive in a way that makes sense to you, that you can communicate to the reader and you can find that reader, I think you're good. So if yours is historical poems that speak in their juxtaposition, and that's what you're doing essentially, and you can communicate that and find that reader, I think that's fine. I mean, that's the beauty of, I mean, the variety of presses, the variety of chapbooks, like, yeah, all of this.
Thanks.
17 new messages, but it's mostly thanks and awesome work.
Well, thank you all for being here.
That's good because we're winding down. So thank you, Christina. Sorry for mispronouncing your book.
No, Troy, I'm so sorry. It's just me. I love ampersand so much. I had to get a bunch of tattoos of them. You know, I don't know. I just find them, the ampersand versus the word and how they're used slightly differently is just, I don't know. I find it fascinating. But again, you know, we all got our thing. So, and you can find a home for it maybe.
So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Christina, for a great and wonderful session. I will send the recording and the PowerPoint and anything else I can think of. I might go through these questions and make sure we answered them all. Maybe later tonight, maybe tomorrow, maybe over the weekend. So thank you. And then I will just promote our next workshop is November 9th. The Art of Writing About Art with Barbara Croker. So I hope you'll come back and join us for that one. So thank you very much. Thank you, Christina.